Good morning. It's good to be here. I'm glad that I was invited to preach the gospel and talk about God's word to all of you. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope that each and every one of us can get something out of this morning. I'm going to be in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6 is going to be the primary focus of this morning's lesson. Isaiah chapter 6. If you paid close attention to the songs this morning that we've sung, a lot of them, and I'm guessing it was intentional, a lot of them are echoing passages from Isaiah 6. And so we sang about the seraphim, and we sang about God on his throne and in his temple, and so forth and so forth. In this passage, there is a vision of God. And that's how the text begins. Isaiah is our human character, and he has a vision of God. That vision of God leads to confession. And then the confession leads to his own cleanliness or his atonement. Once his sins are atoned for, then God gives him a commission. And I want you to notice that fourfold progress: a vision, confession, cleansing, and then commission. Keep that in mind as we go forward. That is kind of a pattern for what Israel as a whole was supposed to do, and it's also a pattern for what Christians and people who come to God are supposed to do. We'll comment on that pattern a little bit later in the lesson. But right now, let's just look at what's happening in the text. In verse 1 it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died." In the year that King Uzziah died. Who was King Uzziah? Why mention this at all? Well, in 2 Chronicles 26 and 2 Kings 15, we can read his story. King Uzziah was one of the most successful kings in Judah's history. He was the king of the southern kingdom of Judah in the mid-late 700s BC. That's when Isaiah began. The first year that King Uzziah died, that's Isaiah's beginning point as his commission in his work as a prophet. Now, Uzziah reigned for 52 years. He began his reign at the age of 16, and the reason he became king is because his father apparently wasn't doing a very good job, and it says in 2 Chronicles 26 that the people of Israel took Uzziah and made him king instead of his father. And so you can see that his dad lost the job. And they said, "We don't want you king anymore. We're going to take your 16-year-old son. We think he can do better than you." And so the king has to step aside and let his son reign. And it's a long reign, 52 years. If you reign 50 years as a king, that's very long. Queen Elizabeth reigned about that long. Queen Elizabeth I. Louis XIV reigned close to that time period. David reigned 40 years. And so 52-year reign must be a pretty good king. It sounds like the people were happy with him. He was a good economic leader. During his time, 2 Chronicles 26 tells us that the economy was booming, that he had added a bunch of regions that Israel had once lost back to Judah. And he was winning all types of wars. He was defeating the Philistines and several other nations around Israel. This guy is the leader you want, King Uzziah. But there's something that happened toward the end of his life that kind of stained his legacy. At one point, King Uzziah decided to go into the temple, and he wanted to offer an incense sacrifice to God himself. Now, if you know anything about the book of Leviticus, which talks about what the job of the priest is a lot, it never says anything about a king being able to enter the holy place of the temple and offer incense as a sacrifice. Well, King Uzziah decides, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that. I want to offer sacrifices like the incense sacrifice like priests do. He goes in, offers the sacrifice, lights it on fire, and then God strikes him with leprosy. And he becomes a leper the rest of his life. As punishment for that. What did he do? He became arrogant. He became prideful. He started thinking that he was someone he wasn't. And he overstepped his boundaries that God laid down. And God cursed him for it. So he's a very good leader. Economically speaking, militarily speaking, nationally speaking. But he had a fatal flaw. Presumption. Presumption in his approach to God. He didn't do it God's way. He did it his way, ultimately. And now it's the year of his death. In verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died. The king is dying. If he hasn't died yet, he's about to die. Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. I want you to notice that even as great as a leader as Uzziah was in Israel's history, even when he dies, there is still a king on the throne. And however long any man reigns or rules, ultimately that will end. But King Uzziah's death does not change the fact that God is on the throne. He says he's on a throne. He sees the Lord. He's sitting on a throne. That's kingly language. He's high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. I want you to notice that when he describes his vision of God, he barely describes God. The closest and most specific way he gets to describing God is the outskirts, the edges of his robe filled the temple. It was as if he was so overwhelmed with the sight, that it was so majestic, that all he could explain was just the very tip of the iceberg. And that's kind of how we are with the Bible. When we're reading the Bible, we're just looking at the very outskirts of God's ways and who God is. And the Bible represents something that we can't see. And he gives us a small revelation of who he is. Well, Isaiah sees this vision. Isaiah sees a glimpse of God. And it's overwhelming. In verse 2, it says, above him stood the seraphim. The seraphim. Now these seraphim, that's the same word that is used for the fiery serpents in Numbers 21 whenever the people sin against God and they murmur and all of that, and then God sends fiery serpents. You remember that story in Numbers 21? And it starts biting the people, and the people cry out for deliverance, and God tells Moses to make a bronze serpent, and whoever looks at the serpent will survive. It's kind of the same idea. The fiery, they were apparently these angelic beings that had some kind of fiery resemblance. And it describes them as having 6 wings each. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And 1 called to another. So one of these seraphim creatures are calling to another of these seraphim creatures, and they said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now notice there's really 3 main points that can be made about what this seraphim says. First, he says, holy, holy, holy. In the ancient world and in Hebrew society, when you would repeat a word, it's like an adjective or just a noun or something or a name, what it would represent is you saying basically, this thing is super strong. So if you said strong, strong, this thing is super strong. If you said strong, 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 then it's as strong as the imagination can think. Here, holy, holy, holy. It's apparently the only characteristic of God that is tripled like that. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The title Lord of hosts, as you can see, if your Bible has the all caps of Lord there, it represents Yahweh, his personal name. Yahweh of hosts. A lot of times that title is used in terms of God being a military captain or a military warrior who destroys all armies and destroys all oppressors. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. We saw in verse 1, Isaiah said that the hem of his garment, the hem of his robe filled the temple. But now the seraphim is saying the whole earth, not just the temple, is full of his glory. And as soon as the seraphim got done saying that, in verse 4, it's like an earthquake happened. It says, and the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Notice that. This is not even God speaking yet. It's just a seraphim, some kind of angelic being. And his voice makes the whole place shake and fill with smoke. It has gigantic effects. And Isaiah is overwhelmed by the sight. And in verse 5 he says, and I said, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah sees a vision of God in verses 1 through 4. And Isaiah's only response is, I'm done. It's over for me. He can't help thinking automatically about his own moral weakness and his own sin and guilt in his life. Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. Not only is he personally guilty himself, but he feels stained by the society around him, the ungodly society around him, and he feels somewhat guilty just because of his association with the society around him. And he feels utterly naked in front of God. And in a way, he is naked and ashamed. Just like Adam and Eve were when they ate of the fruit. And then he says at the end, he gives another reason why he thinks he's going to die. He says, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Do you remember in Exodus 33? In Exodus 33, whenever Moses was on the mountain, Mount Sinai, and God was in the midst of revealing him the law, Moses requested in verse 19, Exodus 33, God, show me your glory. And part of God's response is, no man can see me and live. Isaiah, in some sense, has seen God, and he is probably familiar with that passage and that concept. If you see God, it's a death sentence. And he thinks, my life is over. That's the impression Isaiah had of God. If God were to appear fully in this room right now, what do you think you would be doing in response? I think that we would all be immediately and instinctually on our faces in the ground and thinking that we would not survive the experience. That's the situation Isaiah has here. And Isaiah confesses his sin. I am lost, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. He confessed. He confessed who he really is. You know, the word confession, it means to say the same thing. To say the same thing. And it's in reference to saying the same thing as someone else. And so if you are confessing, then what you are doing is you are acknowledging reality through words. You are verbally acknowledging reality. And so when you confess Christ as the Lord of all the world, what you are doing is you're not necessarily making him Lord of the world. He already is Lord of the world. You are acknowledging him. You are taking your perception and you are aligning it with reality, with what's real, and you are speaking that in consistency with that. When you confess your sin, you are owning reality. And you are acknowledging reality. When we refuse to confess our sins, John says we're lying to ourselves. In 1 John chapter 1, Isaiah confesses. The first response that he has, the knee-jerk response that he has in seeing this vision of God. But to his surprise, in verse 6, God doesn't kill him, and he doesn't die. It says, "Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar." And maybe this was the incense altar inside the temple that the priest would burn, the type that King Uzziah tried to burn himself. He took a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Moments before this, Isaiah is so overwhelmed with his guilt, he thinks he's going to die. Now, an angel comes to him, the seraphim. He gets a coal from the altar. He touches it to his lips. And whether that signifies some kind of painful experience, I'm not sure. Doesn't tell us necessarily. But the angel says, "Your guilt is taken away, your sin atoned for." All of that burden and guilt that Isaiah had just moments before, gone. That's what happens when God forgives you. That's what happens when God cleanses you. When God forgives, it is not a long process. You have to go through these trials before He is ready to forgive you. It can be immediate. And you're a new person. You have a clean slate. And now, since Isaiah's sin is dealt with, God has a mission for him. In verse 8, "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?'" So it's as if Isaiah sees God. These seraphim are calling and worshiping God. One seraphim takes a coal and atones for his sins. And then God, Isaiah this whole time has been worrying that God's going to kill him. But in verse 8, it's almost as if God just ignores the whole thing. And he said, "We got a job to do. Who wants to go speak to Judah for us? We got to get to business." And Isaiah can't help himself. "Here am I. Send me. I'll do it now. Just tell me what to do. Here am I. Send me." Why do you think he was so eager to volunteer for that job? Do you think it might have been because he realized what God had done for him in forgiving him? You see, when we further realize how much God has done for us, it gives us all the more motivation to try to do for Him some small payback of what He has done for us. I'll do whatever you want. Send me. In verse 9, He said, go and say to this people. So now He's telling them, okay, here's your job. I have a message that I want you to talk to Judah about. And it's a weird message. If you were first hearing this as Isaiah, you think, okay, you know, he's known prophets before in his lifetime. He knows how they talk. He knows what they talk about. And then God says, here's the message. Keep on hearing, but don't understand. Keep on seeing, but don't perceive. So that's kind of a summary of the message. Well, how does that make sense? You want me to just go around telling people, hey guys, y'all need to listen, but you're not going to listen? Well, verse 10, he kind of explains it a little bit. He says, make the heart of this people dull. The literal word is fat. Make the heart of this people fat, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Notice that's kind of exactly what happened to Isaiah right here. He saw with his eyes. He heard with his ears. He understood with his heart. He turned, and he was healed. But now God is saying, Judah's time has come. What I want you to do is I want you to go preach to them, but the purpose of your preaching is not necessarily to change them, but to harden them. How does that work? Well, there's this thing throughout the Bible that some have called judicial hardening. Judicial hardening. It's often brought up whenever we talk about Pharaoh's heart being hardened by God in the book of Exodus. If you turn over to me, there's a passage in one of Paul's epistles in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it kind of gives some insight on what's going on with stuff like that whenever someone's heart, when God hardens someone's heart. What's happening there? Is he taking their free will away? Is he just making them be condemned just because no real reasons at all? Well, Paul explains here, he says, starting in verse 11, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 11, therefore God sends them, talking about everyone who refuses to love the truth, in verse 10. Verse 11, therefore God sends them a strong delusion. Why does he do that? So that, and Paul's giving the reason, so that they may believe what's false. Why does God want them to believe what's false in that case? Here's the further reason, verse 12. In order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. There's a sense in which Paul is trying to explain, sometimes if you are just determined not to follow God and to reject His gospel, then God will help you reject it. He'll say, okay, you want to reject it? Have fun. Go do your own thing. Follow your own desires. See where that leads you. And it's a part of His punishment for rejecting God. And it seems like here in Isaiah chapter 6, that seems like what's going on, is that God has given Israel several hundred years, and they're still not doing right, And so he's got to the point where he's ready to almost destroy them. And he's saying, Isaiah, I want you to go out, make sure their hearts are hardened. In verse 11, Isaiah is kind of stunned by that mission. And he says, how long, O Lord? In other words, how long do you want me to preach this? How long do you want me to do this? And he said, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. So what's God's answer? There in verses 11 and 12, the answer is, how long do you want me to do this? Until the whole place is destroyed. That's how long I want you to do it. Verse 13, and though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it's felled. So you get this sense that just God is done. He's done with Israel. He's done with Judah. He wants to destroy the entire place. Everyone is corrupt. And he's sending Isaiah out to further harden them in their rebellion. And then it seems as if there is absolutely no hope. Is Isaiah's job just a demolition job? Is that all you want me to do, God? Well, there is an ounce of hope at the end. He says, I want you to chop it all down like it's a bunch of trees, and it chops it down to the stump. Well, that idea of the stump remaining at the end of verse 13, Isaiah, it doesn't seem like God is talking to him at this last sentence anymore, but Isaiah is giving commentary on what God has said. It says, the holy seed is its stump. The holy seed is its stump. So in the midst of this looking like God is totally giving up on Judah, he's remembering his seed promise. Yeah, he's going to chop down the whole thing to the stump. But the seed's still there. I want you to look over at Job chapter 14. Job chapter 14 says a statement that kind of gives a little bit of an insight here. Job 14 and verse 7, it says, for there is hope for a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease. And Job is using that, a tree, to kind of contrast his situation and almost imply that there's hope for a tree, even if it's cut down all the way to the bottom, but there's not really any hope for me. But you can see that statement about the tree. If there's a stump there, there's hope that the tree will grow back. It might take a long time, but something will grow beginning with the stump. And that's exactly what God does in Israel's history. Look over a little bit at chapter 11, verse 1 in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, he brings up this stump imagery again. Isaiah 11, verse 1, it says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. and he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. From this stump, the ultimate leader will rise, and that is Jesus. In the day that in the year that King Uzziah died, a good leader, a good king. There's probably a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. Who's going to reign next? And are they going to be as good? God is reminding us, it doesn't matter who's reigning right now. He's on the throne. God has the throne that matters. And it doesn't matter how dim things look at the moment. As long as there's a stump, there's hope. And the ultimate reason for our hope is not because of a stump, but because of the one behind the stump. The Lord of hosts. So I thank you for your attention this morning. Remember what we said at the beginning. We see this pattern in this text. Isaiah has a vision of God. It moves him to confession. Then he is atoned for, his sin atoned, he's cleansed, and he volunteers for commission. That's the job of every Christian. You have a vision of God, not in the sense that it's in your mind or a dream or anything like that, but in the sense that you come to the gospel. The gospel is in some sense a vision of what God has done for you and what God has done for you with his Son, Christ. Do you remember in Galatians chapter 3? In Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "O foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." These people were from Galatia. They weren't in Jerusalem when Jesus died, when Jesus was crucified. What's he saying? He's saying, when you hear the gospel and you understand it and it grasps you, you are coming into contact with the crucified Lord. You are seeing Jesus crucified. And so just as Isaiah saw God in a visual sense, when we hear the gospel, we are seeing God in a much more deeper way than Isaiah ever did. And he is calling us to confess, acknowledge reality, acknowledge who we are and who he is in contrast. And then he will forgive us, and we no longer have that guilt, and we are ready to get to work for a commission. Well, what's the commission? To spread that word, to spread that vision, so to speak, to as many people as we can who are willing to listen and who are open-minded to receive. Thank you for your attention. What if you had an appointment with God today and God was going to arrive and talk to you today? Would you change anything right now to prepare? Think about that as we stand and as we sing.